All right, welcome back, and today we're going to talk a little bit about the neuroscience of schizophrenia. Uh, Again, another very complicated disease, which we can really only touch on in this class. So, diagnosing schizophrenia. One thing we haven't really mentioned yet that I'm aware of, but I think anybody who's had a psychology class will be aware of the concept of the DSM, particularly DSM-5. That's the newest version of the sort of psychology diagnostic manual, right? And so this is the one that basically defines what a psychologic disease is and how we are allowed to diagnose it. So basically, in order to say someone has schizophrenia, which is often a complicated diagnosis because there are a lot of different elements to it, an individual must have two of the following for 1 month or more, and at least one of the starred. These are sort of the key hallmarks. So the starred ones are hallucinations, delusions, or disorganized speech. And hallucinations is what we really think of, I feel like, with schizophrenia. But actually, it's really only I want to say it's a little less than 50% of people with schizophrenia actually have hallucinations. Some of the other ones, gross disorganization, diminished emotions. That's one that we don't think about is actually quite common. Work, self-care, or relationships significantly decreased. Signs of disturbance lasting greater than 6 months. Depression and bipolar have been ruled out and not caused by drugs. Right. So, and another key hallmark that we haven't talked about with these is that it really has to be, it has to have a negative impact on your life. So, some sort of mild hallucinations alone that doesn't really impact somebody's life is actually not going to reach the criteria of schizophrenia. Also, one more point on hallucination. When you say hallucinations, I think we all think of visual hallucinations, but you can really have a hallucination in any of your senses, right? This is basically just the idea of your senses not matching reality, right? Or having sort of two competing things. So normally we think of visual hallucinations, like, oh, I just saw a bunch of bats come out of my house or something like that. But actually auditory hallucinations, hearing voices, hearing things that aren't there, are the more common form of hallucination. Again, we're coming back to genetics because really neuroscience, we usually don't bore down from behavior. We start from what we can, sort of the physical world, genes, cells, brains, things like that. So what do we know about the genetics of schizophrenia? Much like autism, it's complicated, sort of thing. Probably even more complicated, to be honest. So it's more common again in males than females. I'm not really sure why male brains always seem to get messed up more easily, but that seems to be the truth of it. And maybe real life seems to make me understand it's probably true. Generally, onset is late teens to early 20s. So you guys are sort of actually in the sort of concern window. However, you only got a few more years, and then you should be all good. So that means that think like there's a developmental component, but that's kind of weird. This is a time when basically development, sort of brain development especially, is kind of wrapping up. So this makes this a little bit common. It seems like there should be a developmental component, but it's unclear why. And maybe schizophrenia is actually starting earlier. We just don't catch it because the symptoms don't seem severe enough until later. There clearly is a genetic component to it, but it's even less clear than autism. And if we look over sort of at this graph here, this is sort of showing the likelihood that you will have it if based on sort of relation, right? So the most closely related people that you could have are identical twins, but there it's not even quite 60%. Where I remember in autism, we were talking 70 to 90% in that case. If your parents had it, then you would only have, it's looking a little less than 10%. Children, if both parents are schizophrenic, though, goes up quite a bit. Brothers and sisters do. Now, this is 10%, which seems low, but if you consider that's much higher than the like normal rate of autism, that is still significant. And the thing is, whereas autism, we had started to pin down a bunch of different genes. If you remember, if you looked at the synapse thing, there's a whole bunch of different proteins that we had implicated. With schizophrenia, we've really only kind of narrowed in on some big regions of your chromosome that seem important. So several chromosome regions have been implicated, few specific genes, the most interesting one that is focused on is MHC. So that's your main histocompatibility complex. It's really part of your immune system. This is what's important for sort of recognizing antibodies and developing antibodies. Why that's important, we'll talk about in a little bit. We don't completely understand, but we have some ideas. One study I found claimed that schizophrenia is 83% genetic. It varies, and again, this is a hard thing to put a label on when you have a gene or a disease that is this complicated genetically. But yeah, something like that, maybe sort of. I think you could find ranges in papers from basically anywhere from like 50 to 90%. So there's clearly some environmental aspect, but genes also play important. Also linked to use with marijuana and other psychoactive drugs, especially if in high use when younger. So that again says something about developmental effect. And this sort of makes sense. It seems to be, again, a lot of what we use to treat schizophrenia is actually going to be sort of used on the dopamine neurotransmitter system, and these drugs disrupt that. So you could see where that would be, but we don't. So again, it's a correlation, not causation. At this point. This is one of my favorite papers to look at about this, and we talked about this briefly early on when we were talking about development, but and this is looking at sort of these are supposed to be your eyes, and we know that based on position in the eyes, basically, if you look at where those projections from the optic nerve go into the brain, this position from your opposite eye or contralateral should go to this area, and ipsilateral should go to this area, right? So these pink ones should go to the pink side, and the green ones should go to the green side. However, if you knock out some parts of the complement pathway, which is really part of your immune system, is what we typically think about them, what happens is they both go to both sides. And these genes, why they were picked, is in the sort of most advanced genetic study looking at I believe hundreds of thousands of schizophrenia patients, found that these genes were the ones that conveyed the most susceptibility for schizophrenia. So you remove these and you start to see this pattern of synapses growing where they're not supposed to. Again, sort of like autism. And basically there ends up being sort of different versions of these genes, and you can see sort of increasingly, basically this version in the tan is the most normal or most widespread non-schizophrenic version, and then as you increase it, you see increased changes in the odds that you would get schizophrenia, and this is correlated with one of these genes. Right? So what does this really look like? So if you look at this in a mouse, this is their lateral geniculate nucleus. That's one of those places that your optic nerve projects to. This is how it should look in a control. And again, you see basically the red is the contralateral, the green is the ipsilateral, and yellow is where they both are. And you should have very few of these, right? You shouldn't have much yellow. You should have this clear, distinguished. That's what's highlighted here. However, in the most severe versions of this, you have quite a bit of yellow, meaning that these synapses are not kept to the place they're supposed to. Now, is this what's causing visual hallucinations? That's not what they're trying to say. This is just really, a use of reductionism. This is something that we can look at very easily. And then the general thought is that this is probably happening in other parts of your brain. Basically, you're making connections or synapses in places that they're not supposed to be. And that this sort of very fine control over which neurons connect to which neurons is lost in schizophrenic individuals. So the circuits that we know are important in schizophrenia, basal ganglia and dopamine clear out. And dopamine is a real heavy emphasis here. We know that your dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, where your working memory, which we didn't talk a ton about, but that's your ability to sort of hold an image in your head or a string of numbers for a very brief amount of time. That seems to be disrupted. And here is again, oversimplified diagram, but again, if you want to go remember back to something, there's this D1, D2 pathway, which could be called the indirect and direct pathway. This is actually this same pathway that's involved in Parkinson's disease, where these are disrupted. Although they are disrupted again in a different way. This is, striatum is part of your basal ganglia, connecting to your thalamus. This is a key pathway that is disrupted. These are also the amygdala, hippocampus, and prefrontal cortex, and it kind of gets more complicated at those ends, but then you can see how that affects sort of higher order thinking and perception and emotion. Right? So how do we treat these today? We actually have, and this varies person by person, much like with antidepressants, some decent treatments here, but they're basically all antipsychotics. And how do antipsychotics work? Well, we're going back to this dopamine pathways normally. And if you remember, right, from Parkinson's, what happened here is that you were having sort of an unbalance where you were sometimes having too much or too little dopamine activity in one of these pathways. And antipsychotics sort of try and block one of those specifically to get the balance back in order. And so there's different dopamine receptors that are blocked with different specificities. And we have sort of some mechanism. We understand why this should work, but it's still a little bit unclear, and it's a little bit of trial and error with each individual to figure out. I always focus on dopamine. Serotonin plays a huge role in this as well, and a lot of times giving different drugs that sort of modulate the serotonin pathway are important as well. I always debate. I sort of like this diagram, and again, this is from another paper looking at individuals with schizophrenia, and then doing functional MRIs to look at differences in brain activity. And they look at the whole brain, and they find some areas seem to be more important than others. And that's what they're trying to show here. However, when you start looking at every brain region, it can be real difficult to know if you're finding something that's definitely important or not. And in the end, it really finds a lot of the brain is important, and it's hard to say exactly. But they're trying to show here that these sort of areas of high accuracy are the most important. And what's showing up here, Buchanan, let's see what else is here. I think insula is a big one, Paladin. These tend to be basal ganglia, striatum, things that are related to that. Basically, all of these regions, are considered relatively high for this paper and important for schizophrenia. So that's what I have, fairly brief on schizophrenia. It's really, we're still a work in progress, although I would say this is a disease we've made a lot of progress in understanding. In sort of the last 10 years, there's been a big push towards understanding it better, and we actually have come a long ways. So it's one of these things I think is exciting to see where the research will take us, in the next 10 years. So thanks for watching. Have a good day.